Hello, this is Miss Strada here. We're going to do our notes over biomes. Before we start, you should have the fill in the blank notes so that you can fill in as we go. Notice that, again, they're fill in the blank in this column. You're learning about the different types of biomes, coniferous forests, deciduous forests, etc. Here are your climate, which is important because you need to know what type of average temperatures and precipitation that they have. Then you have your characteristics, what's distinct about these different biomes. Notice that the plants are empty because you need to write down 3 for each biome, which again, you can pause and go back as many times as you need to write down 3 animals or 3 plants. Animals go here. Plant adaptations are important. Again, adaptations are just the traits or characteristics that the plants have in order to survive in their particular biome. Animal adaptations is the same thing animals have so that they can survive in their biome. So you'll be filling this in as we go. We're doing, again, biomes of the world. All right, so again, biomes by definition is a large region of Earth that has a certain climate and certain type of living things. Major biomes include your tundra, forest, grassland, and deserts. And again, you've learned about the other ones with our project that we're doing. We understand that the plants and animals of each of these biomes have adaptations or traits that help them survive in their particular biome. So we're going to start with the land biomes. So take a moment to fill in your notes. Pause the video if needed. All right, so your tundra is found around the North Pole and near the Arctic Ocean. The climate there, or weather, again, climate is your average weather over the year. It's very cold and dry there. The winter temperatures average around negative 34 degrees Celsius, while the summer temperatures usually average below 10 degrees Celsius, which again is not very warm. They don't get a lot of precipitation. They get about 15 to 25 centimeters per year, but ground is usually wet because of little evaporation, because it's just too cold for the water to really evaporate. So the ground does stay a little moist, but they still don't get a lot of precipitation. They are the area or biome that has permafrost, which just is the dirt that is always frozen. So even in the spring and summer, plants have to adapt to that. And they tend to be flatlands with a few small thin trees. So plants and animals of the tundra. The paragraph below gives you a list of names that you can write down for your plants. Now, the adaptations, again, remember, are what these particular plants do in order to survive. So because the ground, again, is frozen most of the year because of permafrost, they tend to grow close to the ground. And because it's very cold, so they can't really grow very tall either. They have very shallow roots to absorb the limited water resources that they do have. And if there are any trees, they don't grow very tall. They're less than a meter high. Again, here are all the different types of plants that can be found in this biome. Here are your animals that can be found in your tundra biome. All of these animals, again, it's very cold most of the time, so they tend to have smaller ears. The small ears allow them to keep heat trapped inside. They also have a lot of insulation or thick coats. Another way to make sure that they stay warm, they're very migratory, which means that they leave during the winter months and come back during the summer. There aren't a lot of predators there, and there's very little competition for food because there's not a lot of critters there. Here are 10 interesting facts about the tundra. The ones that stand out are the tundra biome only has 6 weeks of summer, so it's very short summer. Again, there's very little to no precipitation, and it's the least inhabited by humans as far as biomes go. And also the tundra is again permanently frozen by a layer, has a permanently frozen layer of soil. Next up is the coniferous forest. It's also known as the taiga or taiga, however you want to pronounce it, and also the boreal forest. Your climate here, the winters are very long and cold. It really only has two seasons. It's either a very long winter or a very short summer. They get 100, an average 100 inches in a year precipitation, but most of that is actually snow. In the winter, the ground is frozen. In the spring, it's more of a swampy place because the snow melts and the ground becomes wet and swampy. This is where you can find your coniferous forests in Canada, Alaska, Northern Asia, and North Europe. Here are some of your types of plants that can be found in the coniferous forest. It gets its name coniferous forest because the trees are mostly conifer. And conifer, if you look, it kind of looks like cone because they do have cones on them. They also have needle-like leaves, so your Christmas trees and things like that. Those needles are covered with wax, and that wax is a way or an adaptation that helps protect the needles from freezing. Other plants you can find. Now, as far as their adaptations, again, we talked about them being coniferous or needle-bearing trees. Another thing is they stay green all year. And the reason they stay green all year is just so that they can absorb sunlight and do photosynthesis to make their food all year long. They have very long roots to anchor these trees because conifer trees get very tall. Now, one of the things they do have to adapt to is the low sunlight and poor soil. And so that keeps a lot of plants from growing on the forest floor. So you'll have a lot more trees than will have plants on the ground because of that. These are your animals that you can find in the coniferous forest. Now remember, your coniferous forest really only has two seasons. It's really cold, long winters, and very short summers. And so the animals here, they have to be able to adapt for those cold winters with similar things that they would do for like places like the tundra. They tend to have those smaller ears. They hibernate to sleep during the winter. They tend to have those warmer coats to allow for them to keep warm. And they also have a lot of insulation or fat to keep them warm. A lot of them burrow, believe it or not, underneath the ground to stay warm as well. Here are some facts about the boreal forest, or the taiga, boreal forest, coniferous forest, whichever one you want to call it. Just know that they all mean the same thing. One of the things that pointed out to me, the trunks on the conifer tree and the taiga forest are used to produce papers. That's where we get most of our paper from. Scientists believe that the area covered by the taiga will decrease by 50 to 90% over the next 50 years, causing many species to become endangered and extinct. Winter, with its below freezing temperature, usually lasts about 6 to 7 months, while the hot and rainy summer is much shorter. All right, next up is the deciduous forest. Here, the climate is summers are warm, winters are cold. It gets about 75 centimeters of rain every year, and so that's about 2 feet of rain. What's different about the deciduous forest and the coniferous forest is one is it's characterized by 4 distinct seasons. Another thing that you should definitely need to know is about the deciduous forest is that the leaves here change color and they fall off the trees in the autumn and grow new leaves in the spring. So remember we just talked about your coniferous or taiga, and we understand that they have coniferous trees which are called your evergreen trees, so they stay green all year long. They don't shed their leaves, but in the deciduous forest they do shed their leaves. So those are the trees that give us those pretty colors that we see in the fall. And because of them shedding their leaves, the ground here is a lot more, the soil is more rich because of the decomposition that takes place in the soil. And again, we talked about how in the taiga, they don't have a lot of ground dwelling plants because the leaves don't shed, but here they do because the soil is a lot richer. So where can you find the deciduous forests? They are between northeastern United States and in Canada. Some are in the eastern United States, others grow in Europe and Eastern Asia. Much of the human population lives in these areas. And as you can see, we live in one as well, right about there. Your plants of the deciduous forest. So, because more diversity is found in the deciduous forest than in the coniferous forest, because there's so much more sunlight, we have a lot of trees that can adapt to varied climates. One of the features that these plants do in order to adapt to those changes in the season is they become dormant in the winter. Another thing about deciduous forests, these trees, they also grow in layers so that they can get more sunlight. More sunlight reaches the ground compared to the rainforest, so you're actually going to find a lot more ground-dwelling plants. And if you go back to the previous slide, just looking at those type of trees, if you notice they have more broad leaves versus needle-like leaves because they're absorbing as much sunlight as they can because they go dormant in the winter. Animals in your deciduous forest. So here's some more animals that you can find in the deciduous forest. All right, so some of the adaptations that animals have, they have to be able to shed their winter coat. If you have like a dog, like my dog, his fur gets really thick in the winter time, but then you start seeing it everywhere around the house during the spring and summer because it's shedding its coat. So animals do that in the deciduous forest because they have to change with the seasons. They also hibernate or migrate for the winter. And so just again, when it's cold, most likely, like bears are an example of that, they eat and then they sleep the whole winter until it's warm enough to come back out. Or they simply just go away to somewhere that's warmer until the winter has passed. And that's what migrate means. Some facts about the deciduous forest. The trees of temperate deciduous forest are deciduous, of course. Their leaves change color with the season and eventually fall off to the ground during winter. If I've said that twice, that means it's important that you know that. The forest seasons are easily recognizable and each lasts about 3 months, and that's where we get our summer, spring, winter, fall, 3 months each. Because they are deciduous trees here, the soil again is very fertile and rich with nutrients. One of the things that people like to ask is why do we have bees and flies and mosquitoes again every year? And that's just because some of the insects in the biome, they can't survive winter, so what they do is they lay eggs before they die, and then these eggs can survive winter and hatch once spring arrives. So they do find a way to come back. Again, the leaves on deciduous trees change color in the fall, and that's just because that's the plant stopping producing chlorophyll, which is what they use for photosynthesis. And so when they stop producing chlorophyll, that means they're not going to be green anymore, and that's when we start getting those pretty colors. And another cool fact is that the leaves fall off because the tree kind of puts a plug between the leaf and the trunk, and that allows the leaves to fall off, and that again allows the tree to store energy until summer comes, or spring. Next up is your tropical rainforest. As the name suggests, it rains almost every day. so it's the most humid biome. It can get almost 10 feet of rain every year. And because it's tropical, which you know that term means warm or near the equator, they tend to be very hot all year long. The largest tropical rainforests are going to be in South America. It is called the Amazon rainforest. They can also be found in Central Africa, Central America, Southeast Asia, Hawaii, and in a small area of Australia. Plants in the rainforest, they grow in layers, and these are just the different layers of the rainforest. You can find a lot of your exotic plants in the rainforest, so here are just a few. So whereas in the coniferous forest, they have issues with the soil because there's not enough nutrients in it, where with the rainforest, they have a limiting factor of sunlight. They don't get enough of it. The rainforest is just so dense with trees and things like that, that the amount of sunlight that trees can get, there's a lot of competition for them. So the plants have to grow in layers, which I showed you before in the previous slide. And at the canopy, which is the top, that's where they're going to receive most sunlight. A lot of the plants, they also have shallow, wide roots, since soil is so thin and poor in nutrients. And just like we talked about, they don't have really issues with having enough water. They just don't have enough nutrients in the soil. So all those plants and producers are fighting for that nutrient, and so they have a lot of competition with each other for that. Another thing is little sunlight reaches the floor, and because there's so much rain happening, a lot of plants have what are called drip tips to shed the excess water. So it kind of just slides right off so that they don't use it. So these next three slides are just animals in the rainforest. There's going to be birds, reptiles, and others. So you can just pick whatever three you want to write down. The rainforest is a very diverse place, so you're going to see a lot of different types of animals, and so many of these animals, they just have to become specialists and require special habitat components to survive. Many animals, they have physical characteristics that help them adapt to their rainforest environment, like camouflage or poison, so your poison dart frogs and things like that. And again, like sloths, for example, they're very slow, but they're able to camouflage themselves with their trees. A lot of them are great climbers, and they kind of have to be, because that's where they're going to find most of their food, especially if they're herbivore. But some of them never even have to touch the forest floor to get what they need. There are a lot of symbiotic relationships, which we'll actually learn about next. And so with those symbiotic relationships, a lot of organisms are able to survive. Interesting facts about the rainforest. They are extremely important because the water they produce is evaporated and then used as rain in other areas. The tropical rainforest is very rainy, as the name implies. It can reach up to 400 inches in 1 year. They're one of the oldest biomes on Earth and therefore have a great variety of animals living there. They provide people with many cooking spices such as vanilla, allspice, and black pepper. And because it has so many trees, it's responsible for the majority of the oxygen production in the air that we breathe. All right, so we're now at grasslands, and there are two kinds of grasslands. So if you saw from your project, we talked about the prairies and the savannas, so you should have done a piece for both. But again, there are two types of grasslands. No matter which one you choose, all grasslands get between 25 and 75 centimeters of rain every year, and most of that is during what they call their wet season. So where are our grasslands? Well, you have your savannas, which are here in this orange. The largest grassland is in Africa. These are your temperate, or sometimes referred to as prairies. These can be found in North America, South America, Central Asia, and northern Australia. All right, we're going to start with your savanna, which is the tropical grassland. It contains the greatest number of grazing animals on Earth. It can be found in your tropics. Again, that means near the equator, which means it's mostly in Africa. Like I said before, it's going to get between 25 and 75 centimeters of rain every year during its wet season. And now that rain is what supports all those tall grasses, and it supports an occasional few trees. Your temperate grassland are also known as your prairies, sometimes referred to as steppes. These are going to be located in your North America, South America, Central Asia, and Northern Australia. So over here for us. Temperate grasslands, they have hot summers and cold winters. Summer temperatures will be well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while winter temperatures can be as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They typically have between 10 and 35 inches of precipitation a year, much of it again occurring in the late spring and early summer. Snow often serves as a reservoir of moisture for the beginning of the growing season. Seasonal drought and occasional fires help maintain these grasslands. So again, if you're looking in your notes, we're starting with the prairie, your temperate grassland. So here are some of the plants that you can find there in this paragraph as well as here. All right, as far as adaptations go for plants in the prairie, they are sod-forming grasses, which means that they tend to have modified stems, which allow them to stay close and stuck to the ground, so that way they don't blow away when the wind comes. They have long root systems, so that means their roots go very deep into the ground. One reason because they are used to having what are called wildfires. And again, even though those wildfires keep the grasses contained, once that fire goes through, the roots are still strong and deep so that more grass can come up. The same way that reason that our grass grows back up is because they have deep roots, and so they're okay to be trimmed. And the grass has adapted to grow quickly during the short rainy season, so when that rain and moisture does come, the grass does much of its growing during that time. Here are your animals in the grassland, the prairie. So many adaptations these animals have to use to survive. A lot of them are called grazing animals, which means they kind of eat what they can find. Most of them are herbivore, obviously, because it's a grass. A lot of them, because the summers get so hot, they burrow to stay cool. And they do have, some of them have the ability to camouflage themselves, which is just to protect themselves from predators around all those grasses. And so then you can also see some more animals that live there. And so some interesting facts is, one, prairie dogs are not actually dogs. They are actually rodents that live and burrow under the prairie. They live in large groups called towns that can sometimes cover hundreds of acres of land. Only 2% of the original prairies of North America still exist. Much of it has been turned into farmland. And the fires on grassland can move as fast as 600 feet per minute. And again, it's because when it's dry season especially, that little flame, like the California fires and things like that, it just takes a little bit and it just goes because it's so dry. Next up is the tropical grassland savanna. As we already talked about, the largest one can be found in Africa. Yes, there are trees in a grassland, but they're not a lot of trees, and one is because they just don't get enough rain to support all those trees. Two, people set the grass on fire to stop trees from growing. And then the other thing is, once those trees actually do start to grow, a lot of animals just eat them before they can get very tall. So you're not going to find a lot of trees in the grassland. Not saying that there aren't any, you're just not going to find a lot. And these are two of the very popular trees. It's the acacia tree and the baobab tree. Here are your grasses and other plants that you can find in the savanna. As far as plant adaptations, again, adaptations meaning this is what they do to survive. They grow in tufts, which just means a collection of grass. So they grow in collection. They have to be resistant to drought because they have their wet season and then they have their dry seasons when they're not getting any water. A lot of the plants, they're going to have thorns or sharp leaves, and that just helps protect them from being eaten from predation, by predation. Animals in the savanna. It's the savanna, think Lion King, all of those animals apply. So your animals in the savanna, they have to migrate, and that's very necessary just because they have to adapt to those rainy seasons. If it's a dry season, they have to go where the water is. So they pretty much follow the water, and that's why they migrate. They've also kind of trained themselves to reproduce during rainy season, and that's just because when it's rainy season, there's plenty of food so that their little ones can survive. If they had a little one during dry season, then they wouldn't have the resources to survive, and so they do save that for rainy season. Again, the largest part of the savanna biome is located in Africa. Almost half of Africa is actually considered a savanna. It's all the animals and plants in this biome are extremely dependent upon each other for food supply. So if one species of animal were removed, the entire ecosystem will be altered. There are many herbivores in the savanna biome, which also bring many carnivores. Herbivore, again, remember, are your plant eaters, but they have developed traits which help them escape predators, such as being fast, being large, or being tall. And so most of your herbivores follow under those categories to protect themselves. The savanna biome does have a long dry season, so plants there have to adapt to this climate. So some plants here actually have the ability to store water in their roots, and others extend their long roots deep into the ground to get groundwater from the water table. All right, the desert. So there are two kinds of deserts. We're really focused on just the first one, which is the hot desert, but there are things called cold deserts, and those are actually found in Antarctica. Hot or cold, the climate, the thing that makes it a desert is the amount of precipitation it gets, and it gets less than 25 centimeters of rain every year. And so that's almost a ruler's length, less than a ruler's length of rain every year. And what makes them different from any other biome is that they are the driest place on Earth. So your desert ecosystem, this desert or deserts are located on every continent except Europe. And depending on the type of desert, you will find them in various locations. Here are some plants of the desert. One of the things or adaptations, they can live there because their roots are close to the top of the ground. And because, again, it gets very little precipitation, so whatever water it can get, its roots have to get right away. So they tend to have shallow roots close to the ground, similar to what you see in the rainforest. Remember, your rainforest is doing it so that they can get nutrients. The plants in the desert are doing it because they need that water. Other adaptations for your octillo plant and barrel cactus and Joshua tree, a lot of them have spines, which are your spikes and things like that. All of them, most of them, store water, which is another word for succulents, and because they have to be able to store water because they don't get enough water. They have shallow, broad roots to absorb water quickly. So that when I say shallow, that means they're very close to the ground, top of the ground, and they're very wide. And so whatever moisture they can get from the air, they're absorbing as quickly as possible. Your animals in the desert. So the desert, again, doesn't get a lot of water, so animals have to eat certain foods to get the water they need. In fact, a lot of animals, they don't even actually have to drink water because they can just simply eat a plant with water and they will have a sufficient amount of water. A lot of them are nocturnal, which just means that they are active at night because it's cooler. It's too hot during the day to go out. They have a lot of large ears. Compared to your, for example, tundra, they have small ears because they're trying to trap in the heat. Your desert animals have large ears because it's just so hot, so they're trying to get as much heat away. They actually do have the ability to store water, and they tend to be smaller animals. You're not going to see a lot of large animals in the desert. They're smaller because there's less surface area, which means that they won't sweat as much and they won't get as hot. There are a lot of interesting facts about the desert, so I highlighted a lot more than I usually do. But some of the things that I wanted to share is that although the daytime temperatures of the desert biome are very hot, they can get very cold at night. The vegetation does not grow very tall, so the desert biome can only accommodate small animals, rodents, and reptiles. These animals can escape the harsh sun by hiding under small scrubs or hiding in burrows. Most of the animals tend to be nocturnal, which again is important that you know that it means they sleep during the day and come out at night because temperatures are more tolerable. Because there is hardly any standing water in the desert, animals either store water in their bodies or get the water they need by eating food. Again, important that you know because I said it twice. The plants that are able to grow in the desert biome store water in their stem. They normally grow spaced out so that their roots can extend and find water. You're not going to see a lot of the plants close together because water is a competition or is something that they're in competition for. And so they're going to be spread out further apart so that they can get as much water as possible. There are some deserts in Antarctica that are known as cold deserts, only because they get a small amount of vegetation that grows there. The driest desert on Earth receives an average of 1 centimeter of rainfall every 5 to 20 years. So if you look at a ruler and look at 1 centimeter, they get that every 5 to 20 years. Because fat retains heat, most desert animals have an adaptation that allows them to store all their body fat in one area. So your camel, for example, is one of those. All its fat is in its hump, and that protects it from getting super hot. Another adaptation. And again, we talked about how they can be found on every continent except Europe. Now, there are more than just terrestrial or land biomes. There are also things called water biomes, sometimes referred to as water ecosystems. And they fall under two categories. They're either marine or they are freshwater. Aquatic biomes, they are determined by their salinity, which you should know the definition for it because we've already talked about what salinity means, and depth of water. Salinity, remember, it's just the amount of salt in the water. So if the water is 30 parts per thousand, then it's considered ocean water, whereas if it's 0.5 parts per thousand, then it's considered fresh water. Anything in between that is called brackish, which is your deltas or your estuaries. So your aquatic biomes, they are also impacted by the amount of sunlight that can penetrate the water. Keep in mind, they have ecosystems, they have food chains and food webs just like the terrestrial ones, which means their producers need that sunlight in order to produce their food or create their own food through photosynthesis. So you have your photic layer, which is your top layer. Light can penetrate this layer. Plants, consumers, that's where you're going to find most of them in that layer. Aphotic, it's below. You're going to find more consumers in this area just because there's less light there. And your benthic layer, that's where there's no light. And since it's the bottom of the water, you're going to find a lot of your scavengers there because they're going to eat all those dead, dying things that stink. And then your decomposers, which are breaking down those nutrients back into the ecosystem. We're going to start with the marine biome, also known as the ocean. It covers about 70% of the earth. and it has salt water. Organisms that live in the ocean are able to live in salt water. They have to be able to deal with the amount of sunlight, the water pressure, the water movement affects their organisms too. So again, there are producers still in the ocean. Many of these producers, again, they live near the top of the water because that's where they're going to get the maximum amount of sunlight in order for them to grow and make their own food. Most of your producers in the ocean are your algae and your plankton, but there are others, but those are your major producers. Most marine organisms, they're going to also live near the top of the water or close to land. And that's just because wherever there are producers, there's going to be most of your consumers because they're going to eat, especially your herbivore type consumers are going to eat those. So many animals dig, the ones that do live near the land, they dig down into the sand or hang onto rocks so they don't get lost at sea. Other large animals live where the water is deep. So again, when you're very deep in the ocean, you're not going to get a lot of sunlight. So most of the food at the ocean floor consists of dead organisms that fall from the surface. Again, your decomposers are nature's recyclers, so they have a big job of breaking all that down. But you're going to find your filter feeders and the organisms that eat them living deep in that area. The organisms that can be found at any layer of the ocean, it really just depends on how much sunlight's available. All right, so your coral reefs are limestone ridges found in tropical climates. So coral reefs are only found where it's warm, and they're composed of coral fragments that are deposited around organic remains. It is the most diverse ecosystem on Earth. You're going to find all kinds of little things there, and that's why it's so important that you do your part to help them from dying. The coral bleaching that you had to look up, that's a serious issue because so many plants and animals live there. And it's so very diverse. If we're losing the coral reef, we're losing those plants and animals. Do remember that we learned that coral are biotic, and they are predators that use stinging tentacles to capture small animals such as zooplankton that float or swim close to the reef. And you're also only going to find them in clear, warm, salt water because they flourish because there's so much light there for all that photosynthesis to take place, for all those plants to producers to make food, and for all those other organisms to eat from them. And they're very beautiful. Then you have your freshwater biome, and remember your freshwater means that it is less than 1% salt concentration. And so that is your still water and your moving water. Your still water are your lakes and ponds. Your moving water are your rivers and streams. Now, depending on if it's a moving water or a still water, many of the plants that live in freshwater, they tend to have strong roots because they need to be able to stay in one place. And again, some plants grow around the edge of the lake or they float on top of the water because that allows them to get that solar energy they need as well to create their food through photosynthesis. Here are some animals you can find in these freshwater. Now, I told you that anything between 1% and 30 parts per thousand salinity is called brackish water, and that's where your estuaries come in. And so your estuary is a border between a freshwater biome and a marine biome. So it's basically where your ocean and your rivers meet. So when the rivers run off to the ocean, this is a little area where they meet. Your salt marshes, your lagoons, your swamps, and mouths of rivers that go into the ocean, again, are considered estuaries. Some scientists believe that estuaries are another biome. Other scientists believe they are just ecosystem. But the thing is, they're not very deep. So sunlight gets to all of the water, which means if there's a lot of sunlight, there's a lot of producers. So you're going to have a lot of fish and plant life. Estuaries support many marine organisms, plenty of light for photosynthesis, plenty of nutrients for plants and animals. And then lastly, you have your wetlands, which are areas of land flooded with water at least part of the year. And so that means your freshwater marshes, which have your non-woody plants, compared to your swamps, which have your woody plants, and then you have bogs and fens as well. All right, that's it for the notes. If you need to hear any part of this again, just feel free to go back to it and listen to those parts again. Make sure you have all of your notes filled in. Thank you.